$5.7 billion every single year. That is what American tariffs are costing Volkswagen right now. And that number did not come from a critic. It did not come from an analyst. It came from Oliver Blume, the chief executive of Volkswagen himself, written in a memo to his own employees this month. This week, 100,000 of those employees found out what that number actually means. 100,000 jobs on the chopping block, 4 factories in Germany facing closure. The largest restructuring in the 89-year history of the company. But here's the part almost nobody is reporting. The tariff regime that helped create this was struck down by American courts. Twice. It is still being collected anyway. 3 numbers explain how a company this size lost control this fast. The first one is the one Washington would rather you did not repeat. Start with the number itself because everything else follows from it. 5 billion euros, 5.7 billion American dollars, not total losses, not projected damage over a decade. That is the annual cost of American tariffs alone, isolated from every other problem the company has. Bloom put that figure in writing in an internal memo, describing the restructuring program as the most comprehensive realignment in the company's history. Executives do not put numbers like that in internal memos casually. Internal memos get leaked. Internal memos get subpoenaed. When a chief executive writes a specific tariff cost down and sends it to hundreds of thousands of employees, he has already accepted that the number is going to become public. And he has already decided that the political cost of saying it is lower than the cost of staying silent. That decision tells you how bad the situation is inside that company. And the quarterly results that followed confirmed it. Volkswagen reported operating profit of 3.5 billion euros for the April to June period. That is down nearly 10% from the same quarter a year earlier. And it missed what analysts had expected by roughly 800 million euros. Revenue actually came in higher than forecast, at 82.4 billion euros. Read those 2 facts together because together they say something specific. The company sold more than expected and still made less than expected. That is not a demand problem, that is a cost problem. Something is eating the margin between what Volkswagen sells and what Volkswagen keeps. And the chief financial officer named it out loud. Arno Antlitz, the chief financial officer, went on camera and said the auto industry had faced substantial challenges over the past 12 months. Then he listed them in order. The heavy burden of tariff costs, the rapid growth of the Chinese domestic premium car market, and the rapidly growing number of car exports coming out of Beijing into Europe. He described an operating margin of roughly 4% as, in his words, a wake-up call, and said the company now has to take a second step of restructuring. A second step, meaning the first round of cuts was not enough. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision is the whole point. The tariffs are not the only thing hurting Volkswagen. Chinese competition is real, and it is brutal. Bloom himself said there are more than 150 competitors in China, and that all of them are now coming into the European market. Anyone who tells you American trade policy single-handedly broke Volkswagen is selling you something. But here is what makes the tariff number different from every other pressure on that list. Chinese competition is a market force. Nobody chose it. Nobody signed it into existence on a Tuesday afternoon. The $5.7 billion tariff bill is a policy. It was chosen. It can be unchosen. And that distinction is exactly why the next part matters so much. Because the legal foundation underneath those tariffs has been collapsing for months, and the collection never stopped. On February 20th of this year, the United States Supreme Court struck down the administration's sweeping tariffs imposed under the Emergency Economic Powers Act, ruling that the statute did not clearly authorize a president to enact broad duties without Congress. That is the highest court in the country telling the White House that the legal basis for its entire trade program did not exist. Most administrations would treat that as the end of the argument. This one treated it as a routing problem. Within a very short window, the administration pivoted to a temporary 10% global tariff under a different provision, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. That provision allows surcharges of up to 15% for no more than 150 days unless Congress extends it. Then on May 7th, the United States Court of International Trade struck those down too. Second court. Same year, same conclusion. But read the fine print on that ruling because this is where it gets genuinely strange. The court limited relief to only the three importer plaintiffs who actually came before it. Every other importer in the country remained subject to the 10% rate. So, you have a tariff that a federal court has ruled against still being collected from everyone who did not personally sue. Volkswagen kept paying. Every importer kept paying. And the clock on that provision was set to expire on July 24th, unless Congress acted to extend it. Congress did not act. So, what replaced it? On July 23rd, the United States Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, announced new tariffs of 10 to 12.5% on 60 nations, including every major trading partner America has. The administration had made clear it intends to use a different legal instrument, Section 301, as the new long-term, country-specific mechanism for imposing duties. Understand what just happened there. The temporary tariff, the one with a hard 15% ceiling and a hard 150-day expiration date written into law by Congress, is dying. The replacement has no rate ceiling written into it and no expiration date. None. The instrument that was designed to be temporary is being retired. The instrument replacing it never has to end. And it was announced one day before the old one expired, which tells you the timing was not an accident. For a company like Volkswagen, that changes the entire calculation. A temporary tariff is something you absorb. You eat the cost for a few quarters, you wait for the legal challenge, you plan for the expiration date. You do not close factories over a temporary tariff. You do not eliminate 100,000 positions over something with a 150-day fuse. But a permanent tariff with no ceiling is not a cost you absorb. It is a cost you restructure around. And that is precisely what Volkswagen announced it is doing, which brings us to the part of this story that has an actual human face. Volkswagen employs roughly 650,000 people around the world. That is not an abstraction. That is a city. That is more people than live in most European capitals, all of them attached to one company, most of them in towns that exist because that company exists. The company had already announced plans to cut 50,000 jobs in Germany by the year 2030. That was the old plan. That was already painful. In his July memo, Blume said the company is now considering cutting a further 50,000 roles globally and closing 4 factories inside Germany. 50,000 plus 50,000. That is where the 100,000 figure comes from, and it is twice as many as the company had previously stated. Blume's own words in that memo were that headcount across the firm had grown over the decades to a scale that is no longer sustainable today. Think about what a factory closure means in a German industrial town. It is not one employer leaving. It is the supplier that makes the seat frames, the logistics company that moves the parts, the 3 restaurants that feed the shift workers, the apprenticeship program that has trained local 18-year-olds for 4 decades, the tax base that funds the school. When a plant like that closes, the town does not shrink. It hollows out, and it stays hollow because there is no second Volkswagen coming to take the space. And workers already saw this coming. Earlier this month, the German trade union organized a rally at the company's headquarters in Wolfsburg, protesting the restructuring and the job cut plans. People stood outside the building where that memo was written and demanded answers. Meanwhile, shares in the company have fallen more than 30% over the past 12 months. So the workers are losing jobs, the shareholders are losing value, the towns are losing their industrial base, and somebody, somewhere, is collecting $5.7 billion a year. Who is that exactly? Here is where most coverage of this story stops, and here is where it should actually begin. Because a tariff is not a fine levied on a foreign company. That is the single most successful piece of misdirection in modern trade politics. A tariff is a tax collected at an American port, paid by an American importer on goods that American consumers then buy. When Volkswagen says tariffs cost it $5.7 billion a year, that money did not vanish into the Atlantic. It was collected by the United States Treasury from importers operating inside the United States. And importers do what any business does when input costs rise. They pass what they can down the chain, which means the price of a car on a lot in Ohio, the price of a replacement part at a garage in Michigan, the price of every component that crossed a border before it reached a showroom floor, absorbed a share of that bill. And the aggregate effect is measurable. America's tariffs have lowered growth, raised prices, and stoked inflation while flooding government coffers with new revenue. Every one of those four outcomes lands on the same household. You pay more at the register. You get less growth in the economy that pays your wages. And the revenue that gets collected is revenue that came out of your side of the transaction, not Germany's. So the political story is that Washington punished a foreign automaker. The actual mechanism is that Washington taxed American buyers of that automaker's products. The automaker cut 100,000 jobs in response, and both populations ended up worse off while the trade deficit the policy was designed to fix moved by a rounding error. That is not a partisan reading. That is arithmetic. And the reason it keeps happening is the pattern underneath it. Because Volkswagen is not the exception here, it is the template. Look at the sequence, and you will see it repeat everywhere. A tariff gets announced to force a foreign company or country into concessions. The target does not concede because conceding is more expensive than restructuring. Instead, the target reorganizes around the tariff permanently. Factories move, supply chains reroute, jobs disappear on both sides of the ocean. And when the tariff is eventually struck down or expires or gets replaced, the restructuring does not reverse. Nobody rebuilds a closed factory because a tax got repealed. That is the part the policy consistently gets wrong. Tariffs are treated as a lever that can be pulled and released, but the decisions they trigger are permanent. Volkswagen is not closing four plants until the trade dispute resolves. Volkswagen is closing four plants. Those towns do not get them back in a future negotiation. And notice what the administration did the moment the courts closed one legal door. It opened another one, wider, with no ceiling and no expiration. 60 nations, 10 to 12.5%, announced the day before the old authority died. Whatever you think of the goal, the method is now explicit. When the law says stop, find a different law. Volkswagen is the largest company to publish a number for what that costs. It will not be the last. There are 60 nations on the new list, and every major exporter and every one of them is currently doing the same arithmetic Oliver Blume did in that memo. Some of them will publish their number too. And when they do, the total is going to be very difficult to describe as a rounding error. $5.7 billion a year, 100,000 jobs, 4 factories, 1 memo, and a tariff that 2 separate American courts have already ruled against, still being collected from everyone who did not personally sue.